Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you. Some inheritances are not handed down with love. They are thrown like a curse. The afternoon my sister tossed the deed to a rotting house at me in front of the family lawyer. Everyone thought I was the loser. 5 years later, she came knocking on that same door. She was not there to apologize. She came because the ruin she once despised was now the only thing that could save her collapsing life. My name is Bailey Cook. I am 32 years old, making a steady living as a project coordinator for Northline Civic Systems. My days usually consist of managing municipal blueprints, arguing with contractors over concrete paws, and balancing budgets down to the last cent. I am used to structure. I am used to things making sense. But nothing made sense today. The dirt on my parents' matching caskets had not even settled. It had barely been one afternoon since we stood in the freezing rain at the cemetery. Yet here we were in the living room of our childhood home in Connecticut, the air thick and nauseating with the smell of white lees and stale funeral catering. I was still wearing my black wool coat, my bones shivering, my mind numb, struggling to digest the raw, gaping hole of my parents' sudden car crash. My older sister, Avery Cook, did not seem to share my paralysis. Older by 4 years, she moved through the living room with the brisk, ruthless efficiency of a corporate liquidator, while I was barely holding back tears, staring blankly at the dust mows, dancing in the afternoon light. Avery was setting out coasters for the family lawyer. She was chillingly calm. Her makeup was flawless, her posture rigid, and her eyes sharp. She looked less like a grieving daughter and more like a predator waiting for the cage to open. It felt as though all the legal documents had been prepared for months, just waiting for the ink to dry on the death certificates. Arthur Caldwell, our parents' attorney for nearly 2 decades, sat across from us. He cleared his throat. The sound was like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. He pulled a thick stack of ivory paper from his leather briefcase. "I know this is incredibly difficult," Arthur began, his voice practiced but strained. "But your parents had specific instructions regarding the swift execution of their estate." Avery crossed her legs. "Let us just get to it. Arthur, we are all exhausted." I stared at her. Not even 24 hours. She could not wait 24 hours. Arthur nodded slowly, adjusting his glasses. He began to read. The legal jargon washed over me in waves, but my brain, trained to pick apart project contracts, caught the essential variables. The division of assets was not a division at all. It was a slaughter. Avery received the Connecticut estate, a sprawling Tudor home fully paid off, recently appraised at nearly $2.5 million. She received the entirety of our father's robust investment portfolio stacked with blue-chip stocks and municipal bonds. She received the life insurance payout, a sum hovering around $750,000. She even received the keys to the safety deposit box holding our mother's vintage Cartier jewelry and antique pearls. Asset after asset, liquid, beautiful, and flawless, slid right into Avery's perfectly manicured hands. She did not blink. She did not show surprise. She just nodded, occasionally tapping her expensive pen against her knee. I sat frozen. The imbalance was so grotesque it felt almost comical. I waited for my name. I waited for the clause that would balance the scales, the secret trust, the cash reserve. Arthur flipped the page, his shoulders visibly stiffening. He took a short breath, avoiding my gaze completely. "And to Bailey, your parents have left the entirety of the main property, specifically the real estate located in Blackthorn Cove." Avery let out a sharp, derisive snort. I frowned, my grief momentarily pierced by confusion. "The main property? You mean Hawthorne House?" "Yes," Arthur said, looking strictly at the paper. "The Victorian property along with the deed. You assume all current liabilities attached to the estate, which unfortunately are substantial." Arthur slid a separate, thinner folder toward me. I opened it. It was not a portfolio of wealth. It was a catalogue of disasters. The house had been abandoned for years. The attached documents included 3 years of unpaid property taxes, formal structural warnings from the Blackthorn Cove Municipal Office, and citations for rampant overgrowth and unrecorded debris. There were notes about a failing foundation, a non-compliant electrical grid, and active black mold. It was a rotting carcass of a building facing imminent condemnation. "There is no cash attached to this?" I asked, my voice cracking. "No funds allocated for the back taxes or the repairs?" "No," Arthur replied softly. "Just the deed. The property is transferred as is." The sheer disrespect of the allocation hit me like a physical blow. I was an infrastructure project coordinator. I knew exactly what these citations meant. They were not just warnings. They were financial black holes. I was being handed a massive debt wrapped in rotting wood while my sister walked away with millions in clean, untethered wealth. Avery sighed loudly, clearly annoyed that my inheritance was taking up more than 2 minutes of her time. She leaned forward, snatched the deed from Arthur's side of the table, and flicked her wrist. The heavy parchment sailed through the air and landed squarely on my lap. "Take this shabby house," Avery declared, her voice dripping with unfiltered contempt. "I do not need it anyway." The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. The entire room plunged into a suffocating silence. Even Arthur stopped shuffling his papers. The sheer naked cruelty of her statement, delivered over the metaphorical graves of our parents, stripped away any illusion of family we had left. She was not just taking the money. She was enjoying my humiliation. She viewed me as the dumping ground for the family's garbage. My hands shook. I looked down at the deed resting on my black dress. The paper felt heavy, loaded with a history of neglect. Anger, hot and unfamiliar, began to burn through the thick fog of my mourning. I did not cry. I did not scream at her. I simply placed my hands flat over the document, my fingers clenching the edges until my knuckles turned white. I picked it up. "Fine," I whispered, my voice cold. Arthur quickly packed up the remaining documents, snapping his briefcase shut with a loud click. He stood up, offering his condolences one last time. As I walked him to the front door, I noticed something deeply unsettling. Arthur, a man who had watched me grow up, absolutely refused to look me in the eye. He stared at the floorboards, the doorknob, his own shoes. There was a tight, guilty set to his jaw. He knew something. A lawyer of his caliber did not just oversee an estate division this wildly skewed without a reason, or without recognizing the hidden play. But he remained completely silent, slipping out into the cold Connecticut evening like a thief. I stood alone in the grand foyer of the house that was no longer mine. Avery was already in the kitchen pouring herself a glass of expensive red wine, loudly discussing renovation plans for the master bedroom on her phone. She was erasing our parents. She was erasing me. I looked down at the crinkled deed in my hand. Hawthorne House, Blackthorn Cove, Maine, a property deemed worthless, a liability, trash. But as I stood there listening to my sister laugh over her wine, a hard, unbreakable resolve settled in my chest. I was 32 years old, and I spent my life fixing broken structures. If Avery thought she could push me out of this family with empty hands and a rotting Victorian, she was wrong. I was not going to sell it for pennies to pay the back taxes. I was not going to throw it away. I was going to drive to Maine. I was going to see exactly what my sister had discarded, not because I harbored some naive ambition of becoming a real estate mogul, but because I absolutely refused to be the victim in Avery's perfectly calculated narrative. This shabby house was all I had left of my bloodline, and I was going to hold on to it with a grip that would make her bleed. The drive up the coast of Maine took exactly 7 hours. But by the time I crossed the town line into Blackthorn Cove, I felt like I had entered a different century. The sky was the color of bruised iron, pressing down heavy and low over a churning slate-gray Atlantic. This was not the picturesque tourist-friendly man of postcards. This was a working harbor built on rusted TR-wars, fading bait shops, and salt-kissed clapboard siding. The moment I pulled my sedan onto the main drag, I felt the eyes of the locals on me. They stood on the docks and outside the singular hardware store, tracking my out-off stake plates with a cold, closed-off suspicion. I was an outsider, an invader stepping onto their isolated terrain. I ignored them and followed the GPS coordinates up a winding, pothole-riddled dirt road that snaked along the coastal cliffs. The trees grew thicker here, their bare branches twisting together like skeletal fingers against the wind. Then The road abruptly ended. I put the car in park and stared through the windshield. There it was, Hawthorne House. If a building could look like it was waiting to die, this was it. The old Victorian stood precariously on a jagged bluff overlooking the ocean, taking the full brutal force of the sea breeze. It was a massive looming structure of sharp gables and a wraparound porch, but it was decaying right before my eyes. The original pale yellow paint was peeling off in long thick strips, exposing gray, rotting wood underneath. The roof line sagged deeply in the middle, burdened by years of neglect. Half the windows on the ground floor were crudely boarded up with plywood, and the yard was a chaotic graveyard of overgrown blackberry brambles and dead seagrass. It did not look like an inheritance. It looked like a haunted monument to someone else's failure. I grabbed my bag, zipped my coat up to my chin, and stepped out into the biting wind. The air smelled of salt, wet earth, and old rot. I pushed through the rusted iron gate, its hinges shrieking in protest, and walked up the warped wooden steps of the porch before I could even reach for my keys. The heavy oak front door groaned open. A woman stood in the threshold, wiping her hands on a grease-stained rag. She looked to be about 50, 8 years old, with skin weathered like old leather and iron gray hair pulled back into a tight, practical braid. She wore heavy work boots and a flannel shirt over a thermal Henley. She did not look surprised to see me. She did not look welcoming either. "You must be the younger sister," she said. Her voice was flat, carrying a thick, hard-edged coastal accent. "I am Bailey," I replied, forcing my shoulders to stay square. "And you are Marlene Vale. I looked after your great-aunt until she passed. Been living up in the attic rooms ever since. Your mother and I had a verbal agreement. In exchange for keeping the squatters out and the pipes from freezing solid, I get to stay." Marlene crossed her arms, her sharp eyes assessing me from head to toe. "I assume you are here to kick me out and sell the dirt." "I do not even know what I own yet," I said honestly, stepping past her into the foyer. The inside of Hawthorne House was colder than the outside. The air was thick with the scent of damp dust, mildew, and decades of stagnant time. I walked into the main parlor, and my instincts as an infrastructure project coordinator immediately kicked in. My eyes did not see a tragic family heirloom. They saw structural liabilities. I saw the massive watered stain blooming across the plaster ceiling like a dark bruise. I saw the buckled oak floorboards, ruined by moisture. Marlene followed me, her heavy boots thurring against the wood. "Your sister came by 3 years ago," she stated bluntly, took one look at the foundation cracks, laughed, and got right back in her fancy car. "Never heard from her again until the lawyer called this morning to say ownership transferred to you." Avery knew. The realization settled in my stomach like a stone. She had seen this disaster with her own eyes 3 years ago. That was why she was so eager to toss the deed at me. "How bad is it?" I'd asked, looking at a wall where the wallpaper was peeling away to reveal dark, fuzzy patches of black mold. "Worse than it looks," Marlene grunted, walking over to a dusty grand piano and leaning against it. "The electrical is all original knob and tube, a fire hazard waiting for a spark. The main plumbing stack is cast iron and rotted through the basement floor. The boiler died 2 winters ago, so there is no central heat. Just the fireplaces and a few space heaters are run off a generator. Oh, and the town inspector dropped off a notice last Tuesday." She pointed to the kitchen. I walked through the arched doorway and found a bright neon orange paper taped to the counter. It was a formal warning of condemnation from the Blackthorn Cove Municipal Office. I had exactly 30 days to present a viable structural remediation plan, or the town would officially red tag the property, seal the doors, and begin procedures to seize it for unpaid back taxes and public safety violations. I rubbed my temples, a profound exhaustion threatening to pull me under. I walked over to a massive oak dining table that was piled high with unsorted mail, old newspapers, and random debris. I began pushing the junk aside, needing something to do with my hands. Near the bottom of the pile, I uncovered a thick stack of letters bound by a brittle rubber band. The return address caught my eye, the New England Historical Preservation Society. I opened the top envelope. The letter, dated over a decade ago, was addressed to my mother. It detailed the architectural significance of Hawthorne House, pleading with her to maintain the original stained glass and the coastal cytolines. There were 4 more letters just like it, each progressively more urgent, asking for a dialogue about the property's unique history. None of them had ever been opened. "She never read them," I whispered, tracing the faded ink of my mother's name. "Your mother was a complicated woman," Marlene said, stepping into the doorway. Her harsh demeanor softened just a fraction, a brief flicker of respect passing through her eyes. "She did not come up here much, but she never let the town bully her into selling, either. The local developers have been circling this bluff like buzzards for 20 years. They called it an eyesore. They called it junk." Marlene paused, looking past me toward the boarded-up windows facing the ocean. "But your mother never called it junk." I asked her once why she kept paying the minimum taxes just to let it rot. She told me Hawthorne House was the only thing in the family with a soul. The words struck me right in the chest, stealing the breath from my lungs. The only thing in the family with a soul. I thought of the sterile, pristine mansion in Connecticut. I thought of Avery's cold, calculating eyes counting the life insurance money before I could process the weight of Marlene's words. The house shuddered violently. The sun had completely disappeared, swallowed by a massive, fast-moving coastal squall. The wind howled against the siding, a high-pitched, terrifying screech. Then came the sound. A loud ripping crack echoed from directly above us, followed by the heavy thud of debris hitting the front yard. "There goes flashing over the east gable," Marlene cursed, grabbing a heavy flashlight from a kitchen drawer. "If the water gets into that exposed decking tonight, the whole ceiling in the master's suite comes down by morning." She started toward the stairs, but her bad knee made her stumble against the banister. "Give me the light," I ordered, my voice sharper and louder than I expected. Marlene looked at me, surprised. "You do not know what you are doing, city girl. The slate is slick as ice out there. Give me the light, Marlene, and find a tarp, a big one." 10 minutes later, I was pushing myself out of a tiny dormer window on the 3rd floor, stepping onto the steeply pitched roof. The freezing rain hit my face like tiny needles. The wind whipped my wet hair across my eyes, threatening to peel me right off the shingles and throw me into the pitch-black ocean below. I was terrified. My hands were completely numb, my expensive leather boots slipping dangerously on the wet slate. But as I crawled on my hands and knees toward the jagged hole where the roofing had torn away, dragging a heavy blue plastic tarp by my teeth in one hand, something inside me broke open. I had spent my entire life playing the quiet, reliable sister. I had absorbed my parents' neglect and Avery's arrogance. I had sat in that funeral parlor and let them treat me like a trash receptacle. But out here in the freezing dark, fighting a hurricane-force wind for a piece of rotting wood, the grief and the victimhood burned away. I slammed a heavy roofing nail into the tarp, bringing the hammer down with a vicious primal scream that was instantly swallowed by the storm. I hit it again and again. I secured the grommets, tying the thick nylon rope to the brick chimney with bloody freezing fingers. I did not care how clumsy I looked. I did not care that I was freezing. For the first time since the hospital called about the crash, I felt completely, undeniably alive. By the time I climbed back through the window, collapsing onto the dusty floorboards of the attic, I was drenched to the bone, bruised, and shivering uncontrollably. Marlene handed me a ragged towel, in silence. She looked at my bleeding knuckles, then up at my face. The wind continued to scream outside, but the rain was no longer pouring into the house. I sat up, wiping the freezing water from my eyes. The town wanted me to panic. Avery expected me to fail. The developers expected me to sell this property for pennies by the end of the week. "I am not selling," I told Marlene, my voice raspy but absolute. "I do not care what the town threatens. I do not care how much it costs." I pulled my knees to my chest, looking around the dark, dusty room that my mother had secretly cherished. I was going to stay. I was going to stay at least long enough to rebuild these broken walls and find out exactly why this dying house was the only thing worth saving. I did not cry the morning after the storm. Tears were a luxury that required energy, and I needed every ounce of mind just to stay awake and execute a plan. I turned the formal dining room into my command center. From 800, In the evening, until 2 in the morning, I sat under the harsh glare of a battery-powered camping lantern, working remotely for my infrastructure firm. I routed municipal blueprints, finalized vendor contracts, and managed remote teams through a spotty cellular hotspot. That paycheck was my only lifeline. Then, from 6:00 in the morning until sundown, I became the project manager of my own ruin. I tackled Hawthorne House exactly like I would tackle a failing civic project. I walked every inch of the property with a clipboard, logging every structural failure, every shattered pane of glass, and every rotting joist. I built a triage schedule. On the 5th day, I walked into the municipal office of Blackthorn Cove. The zoning inspector, a thick-necked man who looked entirely tired of his job, stared at me like I was a lost tourist. He clearly expected tears, excuses, or a signature surrendering the deed back to the town. Instead, I dropped a heavy binder on his desk. It was a phased remediation schedule, aggressively detailed and tightly budgeted. I broke down the structural shoring, the hazardous waste removal, and the electrical upgrades into achievable 2E sprints. I spoke his language. I cited zoning codes, liability mitigation, and local contractor procurement timelines. I did not ask for his pity. I negotiated a 6-month stay of execution on the condemnation order. He gave me 90 days to clear the immediate red tag safety violations. It was not a pardon, but it was enough breathing room to start swinging a hammer. But plans required capital, and my savings account was not going to cover cast iron plumbing replacements. I drove my pristine 3-year-old crossover SUV to a used car lot in the next town over and sold it for cash. I bought a rusted 15-year-old pickup truck with a cracked windshield and pocketed the $12,000 difference. I canceled every subscription, my gym membership, and my meal deliveries. I stripped my life down to the studs. Marlene and I dragged 2 salvaged mattresses into the only structurally sound rooms on the 2nd floor, a small guest bedroom, and a tiny adjoining bath that still had halfway decent water pressure. We sealed the rest of the house off with heavy plastic sheeting and duct tape to trap what little heat the portable radiators could generate. Every spare cent was funneled directly into the bones of the house. Marlene shifted quickly from a silent observer to a hardened, indispensable lieutenant. She taught me the brutal arithmetic of salvaging a hoarded estate. We spent hours wearing thick respirator masks, digging through decades of accumulated junk left behind by my great-aunt. "Do not get sentimental over trash," she ordered one afternoon, tossing a box of waterlogged magazines into a heavy contractor bag. "If it has mold, it goes to the dump. If it is solid wood, we scrub it with vinegar. If it is brass or copper, we put it in the truck and sell it for scrap in Portland." We spent 3 grueling days pulling miles of ruined urine-stained carpets out of the front parlors, exposing the gorgeous, albeit battered, oak floors underneath. My hands were perpetually blistered, my fingernails packed with dirt, but the physical labor was the only thing keeping the grief of my parents' deaths at bay. I needed professional help for the structural framework. Through Marlene's local connections, I hired Dean Harlow, a carpenter who looked like he had been carved out of salt-cured driftwood. He was in his late 40s, chronically unamused and entirely skeptical of my presence. When we negotiated his hourly rate on the front porch, he looked at my bruised hands and told me straight to my face that I would be packing my bags and heading back south within 2 weeks. He treated me like a bored city girl playing contractor on a whim. I did not argue with him. I just showed up every morning at 6, hauling lumber, ripping out wet drywall, and holding the heavy utility flashlight while he cursed at the sagging floor joists in the basement. By the 2nd week, when I refused to stop pulling rotted nails, even after I smashed my thumb with a crowbar and bled through my work glove, his skepticism shifted into a grudging, silent respect. We stopped being boss and employee. We became a trench team. The turning point came late one Tuesday afternoon. Dean was reinforcing the central staircase, and I was up in the attic, clearing out the last of the debris behind the massive brick chimney breast. Tucked beneath a heavy Moton canvas tarp was a sturdy cedar chest. Inside, wrapped tightly in yellowed oil, were 5 leather-bound ledgers belonging to my late great-aunt. I sat on the dusty floorboards, wiped the grime from my face, and opened the first one. It was not a diary. It was an operating log. The pages were filled with meticulous handwritten entries dating back decades. They detailed seasonal tourist bookings, small garden, and long-term room rentals. There were names of regional landscape painters, obscure poets from Boston, and local musicians who had rented out the rooms for weeks at a time to work in isolation. Tucked into the back flap of the third ledger was a hand-drawn map of the property, labeling a writer's annex and a summer studio out by the cliff edge. I stared at the faded ink, the gears in my infrastructure-trained brain clicking into a new rapid rhythm. Hawthorne House had never just been a single-family home. It had been an ecosystem. It had been a sanctuary. My mother must have known this. Avery certainly had no idea. Trying to restore this massive beast of a building into a traditional residential property was financial suicide. It was too big, too drafty, and too isolated. But restoring it as a micro-IT venture was a highly viable business model. I could rebuild it as a boutique retreat space. I could offer short-term rentals for creatives, host small, intimate events, and create a place that generated its own revenue to sustain its own survival. This discovery gave me the exact ammunition I needed. I had found a notice in the local community paper about a micro-rent program funded by the Regional Coastal Preservation Society, the very same society that had sent those unopened letters to my mother years ago. The deadline was in exactly 48 hours. I spent 2 sleepless nights at my folding table, drinking awful instant coffee, drafting a brutal, razor-sharp proposal. I did not sell the board a romantic, weeping dream about saving my family heritage. I sold them a calculated community revitalization project. I detailed exactly how saving the Victorian architecture of Hawthorne House would anchor the historic aesthetic of the coastal bluff, actively preventing commercial developers from knocking it down and putting up a soulless concrete block. I included photocopies of my great oars to prove its historical precedent as a cultural hub for the Northeast region. I presented my phased construction timeline backed by Dean's contractor estimates, proving that I had the logistical capability to actually execute the vision. A week later, I sat in my freezing makeshift command center, staring at the email notification on my laptop screen. I read the words 4 times to make sure my exhausted brain was not hallucinating the letters. The Preservation Society had approved my proposal. It was not a fortune, but it was a solid grant of $25,000. It was real, hard capital, earmarked entirely for historical structural integrity. I walked out to the grand staircase where Dean was packing up his circular saw for the day. I handed him my phone without saying a word. He read the screen, let out a low whistle, and looked up at me. "Looks like we are buying a new roof," he said, wiping the sawdust from his jeans. I nodded, a fierce, unapologetic smile breaking across my face for the first time in months. I had my first actual victory. I was not just surviving the wreckage anymore. I was building an empire out of the trash my sister threw away. We needed a steady trickle of cash to keep the heavy construction dumpsters rotating. That was when I launched Restoration Saturdays every weekend. I opened the heavy front oak doors to the public, charging a $10 entry fee. At first, the locals only came to watch a train wreck. The same fishermen, dock workers, and hardware store clerks who had initially glared at my out-of-state license plates trudged up the steep driveway just to see the foolish city girl drown in her own arrogance. I gave them bright yellow hard hats and walked them through the dust and the debris, but I did not give them a romanticized weeping tour about family legacies. I pinned my massive project schedules, strict timelines, and heavily highlighted budget spreadsheets directly to the exposed wall studs in the main hallway. I showed them the rigorous phased execution plan. When they saw that the roof was actually sealed tight against the coastal rain, the electrical grid was fully permitted and inspected, and the massive cast iron plumbing stack had been successfully excavated and replaced. The mocking whispers completely stopped. They realized I was not playing house or chasing a fleeting aesthetic dream. I was running a highly disciplined, ruthlessly efficient construction site. I applied my corporate project management skills with uncompromising intensity. The chaos of a decaying mansion was categorized into strict non-negotiable work packages. Phase 1 was the exterior envelope, ensuring no more freezing water breached the walls. Phase 2 was the hidden veins of the structure, meaning the miles of new wires and copper pipes. Phase 3 tackled the massive kitchen. Finally, I turned my absolute attention to the grand parlor facing the Atlantic Ocean. Dean and I fought over almost every single inch of that room. He looked at the cracked walls and wanted to gut the entire space, suggesting we throw up fresh, cheap drywall to save time and money. I adamantly refused. I spent over 80 hours on my hands and knees with a chemical heat gun, carefully stripping 4 stubborn layers of toxic lead paint off the original mahogany stair rails. We painstakingly removed decades of thick nicotine grime from the intricate stained glass transoms above the main doors, finally letting ruby and sapphire light spill across the floorboards again. We scrubbed the massive stone fireplace until the coastal granite shone bright, and we sealed the scarred century-old oak floors exactly as they were, leaving the deep gouges and watermarks highly visible. I absolutely did not want a sterile, soulless remodel. I wanted the house to wear its survival and its brutal history like a badge of honor. By early December, against all logical odds, we were actually slightly ahead of our timeline. Then, the brutal Maine winter decided to violently test my resolve. It was not a windstorm this time, but a freak coastal deluge combined with a rapid, unseasonable snow melt. The frozen ground simply could not absorb the massive volume of water. Around 2 in the morning, the old basement sump pump seized, sparked, and died completely. By the time Marlene pounded her fists against my bedroom door, there were 3 solid feet of muddy, freezing water standing in the cellar. All the specialized thermal insulation, the custom wooden trim boards, and the expensive eco-friendly drywall I had just purchased for the ground floor renovation were entirely submerged. I stood on the top step of the basement stairs, shining a heavy-duty flashlight into the murky swirling water, calculating the brutal loss in my head. $5,000 of essential materials, completely destroyed in less than 2 hours. It was a massive, suffocating financial blow. My emergency contingency fund was entirely empty, completely drained by the unexpected foundation repairs the month prior. Panic is a completely useless emotion on an active construction site. I had to pivot, and I had to do it immediately. If I could not afford to finish the walls with fresh drywall, I had to monetize the raw space exactly as it was. The house was structurally exposed, but it was safe, warm, and solid. I reached out to the local community board, printing out simple flyers at the library, and offered the half-finished grand parlor and the massive dining room as a winter workshop space. I charged a minimal daily rate of $20 a chair. To my absolute surprise, the deep isolation and the raw industrial feel of the ongoing restoration actually appealed to people. A local leather worker rented a quiet corner near the roaring stone hearth, setting up his heavy workbenches. 2 independent thriller writers from Portland took over the drafty sunroom, wrapping themselves in thick wool blankets to draft their manuscripts while watching the heavy snow fall over the turbulent ocean. The house was suddenly breathing again, filled with the low, steady hum of creative labor and the sharp smell of strong coffee. Word of mouth spread significantly faster than I ever anticipated. Sometime in late January, a freelance journalist attending one of our impromptu weekend poetry readings snapped a few high-resolution photographs of the exposed parlor walls and the glowing fireplace. 2 weeks later, a prominent New England regional lifestyle magazine published a 2-page spread. They did not frame Hawthorne House as a pristine luxury getaway. The bold headline read, "A dead house saved by discipline rather than a miracle." The article highly praised the gritty, transparent reality of the restoration. It highlighted the heavily scarred floors, the visible wooden scaffolding, and the sheer grit required to rebuild a massive ruin. That single piece of exposure acted like a powerful magnet. Curious visitors from across the entire state began driving out on the weekends just to drink cheap coffee in my unfinished kitchen and soak in the stubborn, defiant energy of the place. One evening, after the last workshop guest had packed up and driven away through the snow, Marlene and I sat in front of the roaring fire. The massive house was entirely quiet, smelling intensely of wood smoke and old timber. I stared into the orange flames, rubbing the tender blister on my palm wondering for the hundredth time why my mother hadn't simply left me a straightforward savings account like she had for Avery. Marlene took a slow, deliberate sip of her black tea and looked directly at me. "Your mother knew exactly what she was doing," she said quietly, her harsh voice softening just a fraction. "Avery always wanted things that were already perfect, things she could show off immediately to her wealthy friends. But your mother told me once, right before she got sick, that she was leaving this property to the only person in the family who actually knows how to rebuild what is broken." I stopped rubbing my bruised hand. The loud crackle of the fire seemed to amplify in the heavy silence of the room. For 32 years I had deeply felt like the invisible child, the one expected to quietly manage the background logistics while my charismatic sister effortlessly took the bright spotlight. When the will was read in that suffocating Connecticut living room, I truly believed my parents had finally confirmed my absolute worthlessness. But Marlene's words completely shattered that toxic narrative. They had not discarded me. They had trusted me with the hardest, most demanding task they had. They knew I was the only one tough enough, the only one stubborn enough to survive it. I looked up at the high ceilings, tracing the intricate, newly secured plasterwork with my tired eyes. The deep exhaustion in my bones felt entirely different now. It was no longer a heavy, suffocating weight dragging me toward the floor. It felt like thick iron armor. I permanently stopped viewing Hawthorne House as a cruel joke, a financial trap, or a suffocating burden. This decaying, stubborn structure sitting on the edge of a hostile ocean was the most profound challenge I had ever faced, and as the bitter winter wind battered against our newly sealed, storm-rated windows, I finally realized it was also the absolute greatest opportunity of my entire life. The demolition of the first-floor study happened on a humid Tuesday morning in late April. We had entirely cleared the structural hazards from the primary living spaces, allowing me to finally turn my attention to the dark wood-paneled room tucked behind the main staircase. The plaster behind the heavy mahogany wainscoting was crumbling, suffering from decades of dry rot. I was working alone, using a heavy steel crowbar to pry the stubborn wooden panels away from the wall studs. The physical labor was mindless and rhythmic until my pry bar slipped and struck something hard with a sharp metallic clang. It did not sound like a forgotten nail or a cast iron pipe. I dropped the crowbar and aimed my heavy-duty flashlight into the dark cavity between the framing, wedged deeply behind the lowest crossbeam, covered in a thick layer of plaster dust and spiderwebs, was a rectangular object. I reached my arm into the narrow gap, my knuckles scraping against the rough wood, and pulled it free. It was a heavy rusted tin box, roughly the size of a large dictionary. A thick brass padlock kept the latch secured. I carried it out to the kitchen, grabbed a heavy framing hammer from the counter, and brought it down hard on the locking mechanism. It took 3 solid strikes before the brittle brass shattered. I pushed the lid open. The air inside smelled of dry ancient paper and metallic decay. Inside the box lay a stack of tightly folded yellowed parchment. Carefully, I unfolded the top layer. They were the original architectural blueprints of Hawthorne House, dated over a century ago, drawn with immaculate precision in faded blue ink. Beneath them was a thick bundle of correspondence from the Regional Preservation Society, letters much older than the ones I had found on my first day, filled with detailed assessments of the property's historical value. But it was the document at the very bottom of the tin that made my breath catch. It was a heavy legal folder sealed with faded red wax, containing a supplementary deed addendum. The legal jargon was dense and archaic, typed on a heavy typewriter, but my eyes instantly locked onto the core phrasing. It was an explicitly recorded easement. It granted the owner of Hawthorne House the perpetual, unhindered legal right-of-way across the steeply sloped land directly behind the property, a right of access that carved a straight path all the way down to the deep water cove below. I walked out to the grand parlor where Dean was meticulously sanding the newly restored fireplace mantel. I handed him the fragile yellowed pages without saying a single word. He wiped his hands on his denim jeans, pulled his reading glasses from his shirt pocket, and began to read. After a long minute, he slowly lowered the paper and looked at me. The usual cynical stoicism in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by profound shock. "Do you have any idea what this piece of paper means?" Dean asked, his voice dropping to a low murmur. It means I own the path to the water, I replied cautiously. It means you control the choke point for this entire stretch of coastline. Dean corrected me, tapping his callous finger heavily against the document. In the coastal real estate market, actual deep water access is gold. The cliffs on either side of your property are way too steep for anyone to build a safe road down to the bay. This specific path, this easement is the only viable route. This rotting piece of paper might be worth significantly more than the house itself. I did not wait for the morning to pass. I immediately drove 2 hours south to Bangwinger to meet with Naomi Mercer, a fiercely intelligent land use attorney whom a former colleague from my infrastructure days had highly recommended. Her office was sleek, entirely devoid of the dust and decay I had grown accustomed to. I laid the aged easement flat on her glass conference table. Naomi scrutinized the addendum with a sharp, predatory focus. She cross-referenced the property coordinates on her computer, pulling up the current satellite zoning maps of Blackthorn Cove. When she finally looked up, her expression was a mixture of absolute professional respect and deep warning. Dean was entirely correct, Naomi confirmed, leaning back in her leather chair. This is an earnest easement. It is tied to the land itself, not the owner. Because of the extreme topography of the bluff, your specific property acts as a geographical bottleneck. But there is something else you need to understand. She turned her monitor toward me. It displayed a massive highlighted grid of the dilapidated commercial waterfront directly below my cliff. I have been tracking municipal chatter in your district for the past 6 months, Naomi explained calmly. There is a very high probability that the town council is preparing to secretly rezone that entire lower pier area. They want to open it up for massive commercial development, a marina, luxury retail, the works. But here is the catch. Any developer who buys that shoreline will immediately realize they are completely landlocked from the main coastal highway by the sheer cliffs. Unless, of course, they'd have legal access to your easement to build their logistics road. The sheer magnitude of the situation hit me with the force of a physical blow. My sister had tossed me this deed, thinking it was a worthless financial trap. She had no idea she had handed me the absolute master key to the town's future economic expansion. If they want to build, I said slowly, they have to come through me. Exactly, Naomi said, her tone deadpan, which means you need to lock this down immediately before anyone realizes what you hold. First, you need an impenetrable corporate shield. Within 48 hours, acting entirely on Naomi's aggressive legal strategy, I established a limited liability company named Lanton House Holdings. I formally transferred the deed of the property out of my personal name and directly into the new corporate entity. This critical maneuver completely separated my personal financial survival from the aggressive business operations, locking out any potential legal liabilities if a developer tried to sue me personally to force a sale. But the easement itself was still legally vulnerable. Naomi warned me that under state property law, an unused easement could be legally challenged and dissolved under the doctrine of abandonment. I had to definitively prove that the path had been in continuous active use. I rushed back to Blackthorn and immediately tore through the attic archives with a verifiable paper trail. We found it in a rusted filing cabinet. We pulled out dozens of faded photographs from 1998 and 2004, clearly showing my great-aunt and Marlene hauling heavy picnic supplies down that exact gravel path. We uncovered faded receipts from a local landscaping company, proving my great-aunt had paid to have the brush cleared along the right-of-way every single spring for 20 years. Marlene formerly signed a legally binding sworn affidavit testifying to her continuous use of the path to access the water over the last decade. Naomi took our mountain of evidence and filed it directly with the county clerk, officially reaffirming and recording the active status of the easement. We were legally bulletproof. With the property secured and my corporate structure firmly in place, I took the revenue we had generated from the winter workshops and aggressively paid off a massive 40% chunk of the outstanding property taxes. The town officially withdrew the threat of condemnation. By the time the warm spring coastal winds began to blow, the physical transformation of the property was breathtaking. I officially relaunched the business, dropping the old family name entirely. We opened our doors as the Lantern House. I aggressively shifted our target demographic. We were no longer a scrappy survival project offering cheap chairs by a fire. The Lantern House was now positioned as a premium high-end retreat destination. We marketed directly to exclusive writing groups from New York, specialized creative workshops from Boston, and couples seeking deeply private, intimate coastal weddings. We offered a curated, rugged luxury that leaned heavily into the history of the house. The scarred oak floors and the meticulously preserved stained glass were no longer signs of decay. They were premium selling points of authentic character. The strategy worked faster than I could have ever predicted. The transition from survival to actual profitability happened in a sudden, overwhelming wave. By the middle of July, I sat at my desk in the newly finished study, staring at my booking software. We were completely sold out for 16 consecutive weekends. The corporate accounts for Lantern House Holdings were not just positive, they were rapidly swelling. I closed my laptop, walked out to the wraparound porch, and leaned against the newly restored railing. I listened to the ocean crashing against the rocks below. For the very first time since I stood in my parents' living room holding that crumpled deed, I was not thinking about how to survive the next month. The massive influx of reliable cash flow completely shifted my perspective. I was standing on a gold mine protected by an ironclad legal fortress. I finally had the capital and the power to stop playing defense. It was time to expand. By the time our third full operating season rolled around, the frantic, pulse-pounding desperation that had defined my early months in Maine had entirely evaporated. The Lantern House was no longer a scrappy survival project or a desperate gamble against municipal condemnation. It had evolved into a highly sought-after elite regional destination. We were quietly famous. I did not rely on flashy billboard advertising or aggressive social media campaigns. Our reputation grew entirely through word of mouth among exclusive writing circles, private architectural preservation groups, and discerning travelers looking for absolute, uncompromising privacy. With the main structure generating a flawless, predictable stream of revenue, I shifted my focus toward the perimeter of the property. Sitting at the far northern edge of the gravel drive was a massive dilapidated Victorian carriage house. It had been serving as a glorified storage shed for Dean's heavy lumber and our excess construction materials. I cleared it out and initiated a grueling 8-month renovation project. I transformed the cavernous wooden structure into 2 distinct, ultra-premium residential studios. I designed the lower unit specifically for audio professionals and musicians, installing state-of-the-art acoustic paneling behind the historic beadboard walls and reinforcing the subflooring to eliminate even the slightest vibration. The upper unit, nestled under the steeply pitched roof, was designed for visual artists and writers. I hired a specialized crew to install 3 massive custom-uled skylights that flooded the space with crisp, unhindered northern light. I furnished both studios with restored mid-century pieces, heavy-woven textiles, and modern high-efficiency heating systems. They were not just hotel rooms. They were highly calibrated creative sanctuaries. Within 2 weeks of listing them, both studios were booked solid for the next 9 months by a mix of documentary podcasters, independent novelists, and couples seeking deeply quiet, prolonged retreats. Managing this level of meticulous hospitality meant I could no longer run the entire operation alongside just Marlin and Dean. It was time to build a real company. I hired a permanent local staff of 6 people. I brought on 2 full-time housekeepers, a dedicated groundskeeper, an overnight security caretaker, and an incredibly sharp local woman who had previously managed logistics for the commercial fishing port to handle our guest relations and booking schedules. I remembered the precarious, suffocating reality of my old corporate life where employees were treated as disposable line items on a budget sheet. I absolutely refused to replicate that toxic structure. I paid my staff 25% above the regional hospitality average. I instituted strict, highly predictable scheduling so they could actually plan their lives. And I negotiated a solid, comprehensive health insurance stipend for every full-time employee. The shift in the town's perception of me was profound. The cautious, begrudging respect I had earned during the early construction phase blossomed into fierce, protective loyalty. The residents of Blackthorn Cove no longer viewed me as a clever, opportunistic outsider. They saw me as a foundational pillar of their local economy, someone who was actively building a sustainable community rather than just extracting wealth from it. As the operational footprint grew, I maintained a ruthless, almost paranoid level of financial discipline. I completely refused to take out commercial loans or leverage the core estate for fast expansion capital. Every single custom light fixture in the carriage house, every square foot of imported stone for the new patio, and every dollar of payroll was funded by hard, verified cash generated directly from fully executed booking contracts. My growth was slower than a traditional real estate developer would have advised, but my foundation was entirely made of bedrock. I carried absolutely zero corporate debt. If we did not have the cash physically sitting in the bank account, we simply did not build. This intense focus on security led me back to Naomi Mercer's sleek conference room in Bangor. She reviewed my soaring quarterly profit margins and immediately raised a red flag. "You are generating serious, highly visible wealth now," Naomi warned me, tapping her expensive pen against my financial ledgers. "When you were just scraping by, nobody cared. But a highly profitable, debt-free coastal estate with a legally ironclad deep water easement is a massive target. You need to build a fortress within a fortress." I did not hesitate. I authorized Naomi to aggressively restructure my entire portfolio. We moved the core real estate, the physical land, the main house, and the critical waterfront easement out of the standard corporate holding and directly into a highly restricted, irrevocable blind trust. The operational business, the entity that actually handled the hospitality revenues, the payroll, and the daily liabilities, was placed into a separate multi-tiered limited liability company. This complex legal architecture meant that even in the event of a catastrophic lawsuit or a hostile external challenge, the actual land and the right-of-way were legally untouchable. I locked the doors, drew the bridges, and sealed the vaults. My newly fortified position was tested almost immediately. A sleek, aggressive boutique hospitality conglomerate based out of Manhattan caught wind of our phenomenal occupancy rates and our unique coastal aesthetic. They dispatched 2 senior acquisition executives who drove up the coast in a black, luxury utility vehicle. They sat at my restored dining table, sipping our premium local coffee, and slid a glossy presentation folder across the oak wood. They offered me a staggering sum of money for a 60% controlling stake in the business. They wanted to franchise the Lantern House brand, replicate the aesthetic across the eastern seaboard, and pump the property full of high-volume tourist traffic. I looked at their projected revenue charts, closed the glossy folder, and pushed it back across the table. I flatly declined. I offered them a highly restricted non-equity brand partnership instead. They could refer their overflow elite clientele to my property for a standard commission fee, but they would never own a single share of my voting stock, and they would never dictate my operational pace. I had not spent 3 years inhaling plaster dust and fighting winter storms just to hand the reins over to a boardroom of strangers. While I was methodically securing my future in Maine, distant, chaotic echoes from my past began to drift up the coastline. The affluent high society circles of New England were surprisingly small, and gossip traveled fast. I heard the updates through a former colleague who still worked near my old hometown. Avery had not kept the beautiful, pristine Tudor mansion our parents had meticulously maintained. The moment the title legally cleared probate, she sold the estate for cash. Instead of investing the millions, she had embedded herself in a flashy, high-leveraged lifestyle. She was now engaged to a slick, highly aggressive commercial real estate developer named Grant Holloway. According to the industry rumors, Grant was steering Avery's inherited fortune into high-risk, short-term luxury condominium flips in highly volatile emerging markets. They were constantly seen at high-profile charity galas, driving leased exotic sports cars and projecting an image of limitless, effortless wealth. They were living entirely on speculation and heavy, dangerous margins. 3 years prior, sitting in that suffocating funeral parlor, Hearing about my sister squandering our family legacy might have sparked a massive flare of bitter resentment. I might have felt the urge to prove my own success, to call her and rub my immaculate balance sheets in her face. But sitting in my quiet, meticulously organized office overlooking the crashing Atlantic Ocean, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, chilling detachment. I did not want her chaotic money. I did not want her validation, and I certainly did not want her erratic, destructive orbit pulling at my carefully calibrated gravity. I simply thanked my former colleague for the update, deleted the email, and went back to reviewing my landscaping budgets. I refused to let the ghost of her contempt dictate my actions anymore. Late that evening, after the staff had gone home and the guests were quietly settled into their respective wings, I took a slow walk down the long gravel driveway. I turned around at the iron gates and looked back at the property. The Lantern House stood resolute and magnificent against the dark, sprawling coastal sky. Warm golden light spilled from the beautifully restored stained-glass transoms, casting long, elegant shadows across the manicured lawns. The carriage house glowed softly in the distance, a testament to quiet, productive sanctuary. The entire estate looked incredibly solid. It was not a fragile, flashy showpiece built on borrowed time, massive bank loans, and the desperate need for external approval. It was a fortress of quiet, undeniable strength, rooted deeply into the absolute bedrock of the coast. It was beautiful. It was unyielding, and I had built every single inch of it on my own terms. The 5-year anniversary of my arrival in Blackthorn Cove arrived on a crisp, completely cloudless Tuesday morning in early October. I was walking the far southern edge of my property, holding a mug of black coffee, conducting my usual perimeter check before the weekend guests arrived. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and salt. Everything was perfectly still. Then I saw them, driven deep into the damp earth. Just inches from the legal boundary line of my right-of-way were 4 wooden surveyor stakes tied with bright neon pink flagging tape. They had not been there the day before. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on the gravel. I traced the imaginary line connecting the stakes. They formed a precise, aggressive boundary, tracking directly parallel to my easement, the exact path that led down the steep wooded bluff to the deep water below. In the infrastructure business, neon pink tape only meant one thing. A massive, heavily funded commercial project was no longer just a rumor. It was entering the active surveying phase. I walked straight back to my office, locked the heavy oak door, and dialed Naomi Mercer. It took her exactly 48 hours to pull the municipal filings, pierce the corporate veils, and call me back. When she did, her voice was stripped of its usual professional warmth. It was completely flat and dangerously serious. The town council had secretly pushed through the commercial rezoning for the abandoned lower waterfront. An aggressive investment consortium was quietly and rapidly buying up every single scrap of useless land at the base of the cliff. The consortium was operating under a web of shell companies, but Naomi had tracked the primary funding source. It was a firm called Hollow Meridian Developments, Grant Hollow. Avery had tied herself to the exact man who was currently trying to pave the Blackthorn Cove shoreline. Their grand vision was a sprawling ultra-luxury marina complete with a boutique hotel and a massive high-end retail promenade. But Naomi had also found the fatal flaw in their aggressive master plan. The waterfront they were acquiring was entirely boxed in by sheer unstable granite cliffs on 3 sides, and the volatile Atlantic Ocean on the 4th. To bring down the heavy excavation machinery, the concrete trucks, and the steel beams required to build a marina, they needed a reinforced logistics road. And once the hotel opened, they needed a permanent, legally viable access road for their wealthy patrons. My specific property and my legally fortified easement was the only geographical location where a road could actually be built without causing a catastrophic landslide. Without my legal permission or without forcing me to sell my entire estate, Grant Holloway possessed nothing but a very expensive strip of useless, inaccessible mud. The entire multi-million-dollar project was fundamentally gridlocked. The timing of what happened next was so transparent, it was almost insulting. Less than 24 hours after Naomi explained the strategic bottleneck to me, my private cell phone rang. It was an unfamiliar Connecticut area code. I let it ring 4 times before answering. Daily. Oh my gosh. Is that you? It was Avery. 5 entire years of absolute, unbroken silence. And her voice sounded exactly the same. It possessed that sickly sweet high-pitched artificial warmth she always used when she was trying to manipulate our mother into buying her something expensive. Yes, Avery. It is me, I replied, my voice perfectly level. She let out a dramatic, breathy sigh. It has been far too long. Daily, I was just talking to Grant the other day, and I told him I simply miss my little sister. We are going to be driving up the coast this week, looking at some antique furniture, and we would absolutely love to stop by and see you just to visit. You know, like family. A cold, sharp wave of adrenaline washed over me. I did not yell. I did not hang up the phone. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked out the window at the distant ocean. I was not the shattered, grieving 32-year-old woman standing in a funeral parlor in a moor. I was the chief executive of a highly profitable, legally fortified estate. You can come, I told her calmly, but I am running a fully booked business now. I only have a brief window on Thursday afternoon, between 2:00 and 4:00. Do not arrive early and do not expect to stay for dinner. I hung up before she could reply. I immediately went into preparation mode. I did not want them walking into a quiet, vulnerable house. On Thursday morning, I instructed my head groundskeeper to run the loud commercial mowers right along the front lawns. I made sure my guest relations manager was visibly stationed at the front reception desk in the main foyer handling phone calls. Finally, I logged into my secure network and double-checked the feeds from the 4 high-definition security cameras I had discreetly installed around the property perimeter in the main gate. They were all actively recording. I was establishing my absolute control over the environment. At precisely 2:00, a massive black, incredibly expensive luxury utility vehicle crunched slowly up my long gravel driveway. Avery stepped out of the passenger side first. She looked impossibly polished, draped in a thick cream cashmere coat, her hair perfectly styled. She flashed a massive, brilliant smile that completely failed to reach her cold, calculating eyes. Grant stepped out from behind the steering wheel. I had never met him in person, but he looked exactly like the type of man who built his fortune on aggressive leverage and intimidation. He wore a sharply tailored suit without a tie before he even looked at me or said a word of greeting. His eyes began to sweep the property. His gaze did not linger on the beautiful stained glass or the historic wraparound porch. He was looking at the width of my driveway. He was looking at the exact grade of the slope leading toward the back of the estate. He was calculating the structural load capacity of my retaining walls and measuring the distance to the water. Bailey, Avery cried out, rushing up the wooden steps of the porch and wrapping me in a stiff, highly perfumed hug. Oh my God, look at this place. When you took that awful, rotting old house, I honestly thought it would collapse within a week. You actually made it livable. It is more than livable, Avery, I said smoothly, stepping back from her embrace. It is fully booked for the next 10 months. Grant stepped forward, extending a perfectly manicured hand. Grant Holloway, Avery has told me so much about you. Have to say I am incredibly impressed. Taking a distressed, isolated coastal asset and turning it into a boutique cash flow operation takes serious grit, especially with a lot size of exactly 3.2 acres and a water depth of 40 ft at low tide. The air on the porch suddenly felt heavy. Grant smiled smoothly, but his eyes were hard and predatory. He had just made a massive, arrogant mistake. You do not casually know the exact acreage of an arranged sister-in-law's property, nor do you know the precise maritime depth of the private cove behind her house, unless you have been intensely studying the municipal zoning maps and the geological surveys. He had thoroughly researched me long before this sudden spontaneous family visit. I did not react to his slip. I simply nodded and led them inside. I seated them in the grand parlor right in front of the massive stone fireplace I had scrubbed clean with my own bleeding hands 5 years ago. I did not offer them wine or a sprawling meal. I offered them plain water. Avery sat rigidly on the edge of the leather sofa and immediately launched into a highly rehearsed, emotionally manipulative monologue. She spoke softly, looking down at her diamond engagement ring. She talked extensively about the heavy, blinding fog of grief. She mentioned how overwhelmed she was after the funeral, how managing the estate in Connecticut had been such a massive isolating burden. "We all do things we regret when we are hurting," Avery said, finally looking up at me with wide, fake, sympathetic eyes. "I know things were incredibly tense between us when the lawyer read the will, but we are blood, Bailey. We only have each other left in this world. I think it is time we both put the past behind us and start acting like sisters again." She did not apologize for her cruelty. She did not admit that she had aggressively hoarded the entire family fortune while throwing me into a financial death trap. She was simply trying to wave away the past like a minor mutual inconvenience, attempting to manufacture a warm, forgiving atmosphere out of thin air. I sat perfectly still in my armchair. I watched Grant casually check the time on his heavy silver watch, his jaw clenching slightly with impatience. The tension radiating off him was almost electric. My intuition, honed sharp by years of managing volatile contractors and navigating aggressive town zoning boards, locked onto the absolute truth. They were not sitting in my parlor because they felt a sudden profound sting of remorse. They were not here to rebuild our shattered family dynamic. Avery's expensive lifestyle and Grant's massive coastal development project were bleeding cash, trapped behind a wall of solid granite. They had come back to the rotting house they once mocked because I possessed the only key that could save them, and they desperately needed me to sign it away. I did not end the visit at 400. Instead, I invited them to stay for dinner in the main dining room. I did not do this out of sisterly affection or polite hospitality. I did it because in negotiations, controlling the physical environment is half the battle. I wanted them sitting at the massive oak table I had restored by hand, eating off plates paid for by my own success, surrounded by the undeniable reality that I did not need them. Avery took the bait immediately. She spent the first 45 minutes of the meal attempting to drown me in nostalgia. She produced a small leather-bound photo album from her designer handbag, sliding faded pictures of our childhood across the polished wood. She pointed to a photograph of us at a summer lake house, her voice dripping with artificial sorrow. "We used to be so close," Avery murmured, tracing the edge of the photograph. "Mom and Dad would hate to see us this distant. No matter what happened in the past, we are still family. That is what truly matters, right?" I took a slow sip of my water. "Family," I repeated, letting the words sit in the air. "Exactly," Avery said, leaning forward, her eyes wide with manufactured sincerity. "And I know you were angry after the funeral. I know the will seemed harsh, but you have to understand my perspective back then. I knew you always preferred the quiet life. You were never comfortable with the pressure of high finance or managing massive portfolios. I let you take this property because I honestly believed you were suited for something quieter than cash." The sheer audacity of her historical revisionism was almost breathtaking. She was openly attempting to rebrand a vicious, calculated financial abandonment as an act of profound sisterly grace. I felt a cold knot of disgust tighten in my stomach, but my face remained an absolute mask of polite interest. Sensing the emotional groundwork was laid, Grant smoothly shifted gears. He set his wine glass down, steepled his fingers, and adopted the practiced, benevolent tone of a corporate savior. "Avery is right," Grant interjected, offering a completely hollow smile. "And because we are family, we want to include you in a monumental opportunity, something that will secure generational wealth for all of us." "Generational wealth," I echoed softly. "From what I am putting together, a massive coastal revitalization project," Grant explained, his hands moving expansively. "A premium marina, a luxury boutique hotel, and a high-end retail promenade right at the base of the bluff. It is going to put Blackthorn Cove on the international map. But to finalize the municipal permits, we need a unified front. The town wants to see cohesive community integration. Specifically, we need to temporarily utilize the old gravel path at the back of your property for construction access and eventually convert it into a permanent scenic carriage road for our guests." He reached into his tailored jacket and produced a crisp single-page contract. He slid it across the oak table toward me. "We are prepared to offer you $250,000, Grant said smoothly. Just assign a standard release form for the easement. It is incredibly generous. You keep your inn, you get a massive cash injection, and we build a beautiful neighbor right next door. Everybody wins. $250,000. On paper, to an ordinary citizen, it sounded like a staggering windfall. But my brain instantly ran the true commercial arithmetic. He was trying to buy the singular logistical artery of a multi-million-dollar commercial development for the price of a modest suburban starter home. He was treating me like an idiot. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw the paper back at him. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. A 50-room luxury hotel requires massive infrastructure, I noted casually. Where exactly are you routing the commercial sewage lines? The municipal grid up here on the bluff is already operating at 80% capacity. Grant blinked, his smooth smile faltering for a fraction of a second. We have engineers working on a private septic solution. A private solution on the waterfront? I tilted my head, feigning mild confusion. The State Environmental Protection Agency mandates a 200t setback for commercial leach fields near tidal zones. The strip of land you are acquiring at the base of the cliff is barely 150t deep at high tide. You do not have the physical square footage to legally process that kind of waste. Grant shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes narrowing. We are negotiating a variance. And what about the parking? I pressed, my voice remaining entirely conversational. A commercial marina and hotel complex requires a minimum of 300 parking spaces by town ordinance. The sheer volume of impervious surface runoff from 300 asphalt spaces will trigger an immediate state-level environmental review, unless, of course, you are planning to route your drainage pipes directly underneath my property to bypass the lower wetlands. Is that also included in this $250,000 release form? The dining room went completely silent. Grant stared at me, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked in his cheek. The arrogant, dismissive developer who had walked through my front door an hour ago was suddenly realizing he was sitting across from a seasoned infrastructure coordinator who knew every single rule of his dirty game. Avery, sensing the negotiations slipping entirely out of their control, lost her carefully constructed patience. The sweet, nostalgic sister vanished, replaced by the vicious, entitled woman I remembered from the lawyer's office. Bailey, stop being so relentlessly difficult. Avery snapped, slamming her hand flat against the oak table. Grant is trying to do you a massive favor. We are offering you a fortune for a useless dirt path. It is not like you earned this leverage through some brilliant business strategy anyway. You just got incredibly lucky finding that stupid tin box behind the study wall. The words echoed loudly against the plaster walls hanging in the air, like a physical confession. I stopped breathing. My heart slammed painfully against my ribs. That stupid tin box behind the study wall. I had never told Avery about the box. I had never told anyone except Dean and Naomi. The Regional Preservation Society letters were hidden inside it. The original century-old architectural blueprints were inside it, and the heavy legal folder containing the recorded easement was inside it. The box had been securely sealed behind a layer of original L and plaster for decades, until I smashed it open with a crowbar. There was absolutely no way Avery could have known about a hidden tin box behind the wainscoting unless she had hired a private investigator, a specialized appraiser, or an architect to aggressively inspect the property years ago. Unless she had secretly opened the walls herself before the funeral, the final sickening piece of the puzzle locked into place with terrifying clarity. Avery had known. She had known about the easement long before our parents died. She knew Hawthorne House possessed the singular right-of-way to the entire lower waterfront. But she also knew the house was facing condemnation, riddled with black mold and requiring hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-risk structural repairs. She did not want to spend her own inheritance fixing a rotting ruin just to hold onto a piece of paper. So she tossed the house to me, letting me absorb all the grueling physical labor, the crushing financial risk, and the municipal threats. She assumed I would either fix it for her or fail entirely and sell it to Grant for pennies. She had weaponized my inheritance as a holding company for her own future greed. My sister did not just abandon me. She had actively, methodically set me up to bleed. Grant immediately realized the catastrophic magnitude of Avery's slip-up. He shot her a look of pure, unadulterated fury, but the damage was already permanently done. I looked at Avery. Her face palled as she registered the profound silence in the room and the magnitude of what she had just accidentally confessed. I could have screamed at them. I could have thrown them out of my house right then and there, banished them into the cold October night. But anger is a loud, messy emotion, and I needed absolute clinical precision for what I was going to do next. I picked up the single-page contract Grant had pushed across the table. I folded it neatly in half and placed it beside my watered glass. "This is a very complex proposal," I said, my voice eerily calm, devoid of any visible anger. "I am not going to sign anything tonight. I need to have my own legal counsel review the terms and verify the environmental liabilities you mentioned." Grant let out a slow, deeply relieved breath, clearly believing he had salvaged the disaster. He stood up quickly, buttoning his suit jacket. "Of course, take a few days. Review it with your people. We want everyone to feel entirely comfortable with this family partnership." I stood up and politely walked them out to the front porch. I watched them climb back into their massive, overpriced vehicle. Avery offered one last strained wave through the tinted window before they drove away, their red tail lights disappearing down the dark gravel driveway. They were driving back to Connecticut, believing they still had a viable chance to manipulate me, believing my delay was just standard negotiation tactics. They thought the game was still being played. I locked the heavy front door, walked back into the dining room, and picked up the contract. I tore it straight down the middle, dropped the pieces into the roaring fireplace, and watched them burn to ash. I did not need a few days to think about their offer. I just needed enough time to arm the legal landmine I was about to detonate under their entire lives. Exactly at 8:00, the morning following that suffocating dinner, my phone vibrated against the marble kitchen counter. It was Naomi Mercer. I did not even have time to pour my coffee before her sharp, highly caffeinated voice filled the room. She had been monitoring the municipal planning portal since dawn, and her aggressive vigilance had just paid off in spades. Grant Holloway and his legal team had formally submitted their preliminary zoning application to the Blackthorn Cove Town Council. It was a massive 300-page document filled with glossy architectural renderings and complex environmental impact studies. But Naomi had bypassed the flashy hotel designs and dug straight into the logistical appendices. Tucked away in a tiny, easily overlooked subsection regarding perimeter traffic flow, Grant's lawyers had included a specific legal definition of my historic right-of-way. They formally described the easement as a dormant historical artifact completely devoid of practical modern utility and heavily implied it had been functionally abandoned by the current property owner. It was a brilliant, incredibly dirty legal maneuver. If the town council accepted that definition on the official public record, Grant could easily petition a state judge to dissolve my easement entirely under the legal doctrine of abandonment. He was not just trying to buy me out anymore. He was actively laying the groundwork to erase my property rights by sheer bureaucratic force. I did not panic. I felt a cold, hyper-focused calm settle over my mind. I immediately called Dean Harlow and Marlene Vale, ordering them to drop their morning tasks and meet me in the main dining room. Within an hour, Naomi drove up from Bangor carrying her heavy leather briefcase. We transformed the massive oak table into a forensic war room. Our singular objective was to build an impenetrable documented fortress, proving the continuous, unbroken commercial and personal utilization of that gravel path. 8 carbon copy invoices dating back years. We found work orders for $1,700 of crushed stone delivered specifically to grade the slope, and receipts for heavy machinery rentals used to clear the winter deadfall from the path edges. Marlene meticulously combed through our recent operational records, pulling hundreds of pages of vendor delivery logs, catering schedules, and event permits that explicitly proved our premium guests and local suppliers used the path every single week to access the private shoreline for weddings and creative retreats. But as we built our mountain of recent evidence, Marlene suddenly stopped flipping through the guest logs. She stared blankly out the window for a long moment, her brow heavily furrowed in deep concentration. She turned to me, her voice low and absolute. She remembered a specific heavy cardboard box tucked away in the deepest corner of the third-floor attic. It was a box she had packed herself over a decade ago, long before my parents passed away. We abandoned the dining room and marched up the 2 flights of stairs. The air in the attic was thick with dust and the smell of ancient pine framing. Marlene navigated through the maze of antique furniture and dragged a heavily taped stained box out into the light of the dormer window. I took a box cutter and sliced through the brittle tape. Inside was a chaotic archive of my late mother's personal correspondence. We dug through old holiday cards and expired utility bills until my hands brushed against a thick, heavy manila envelope. The return address belonged to a highly prestigious commercial appraisal firm based out of Boston. The postmark was dated exactly 7 years ago. I carefully unclasped the metal heavy-duty fastener and slid the contents out. It was a preliminary real estate valuation dossier commissioned to assess the potential market value of Hawthorne House. The appraisal explicitly warned about the catastrophic structural liabilities, the failing foundation, and the black mold, but the executive summary contained a highly detailed, brightly highlighted section focusing entirely on the strategic value of the deep water easement. The firm explicitly stated that while the house was a financial sinkhole, the land access was a highly lucrative commercial choke point. The report itself was a massive discovery, but it was the physical envelope that made the breath catch in my throat. Scrolled across the top corner of the manila paper, written in tight, aggressive blue ink, was a handwritten note. The handwriting was unmistakably Avery's. It read, "Liability completely outweighs asset. Water access valuable, but contingent on impossible repair costs. Do not retain." I stared at the blue ink, the blood rushing in my ears. I handed the envelope down to Naomi. She read the handwritten note, looked at the appraisal date, and let out a sharp, genuine laugh of absolute disbelief. This was the silver bullet. This singular piece of paper completely incinerated the emotional narrative Avery had spun at my dinner table. She had not given me this house out of sisterly grace, or because she thought I preferred a quiet life. She had secretly intercepted and read the professional appraisal years before our parents died. She knew exactly how valuable the easement was, but she also knew the house required hundreds of thousands of dollars in brutal, high-risk repairs just to keep it from collapsing. She had actively chosen to dump the entire physical and financial burden onto me, fully expecting me to fail so she could eventually swoop in and leverage the land once the house was condemned. "This changes the entire legal landscape," Naomi said, her eyes gleaming with predatory excitement. "If Avery ever tries to claim she was defrauded out of her rightful inheritance, or if Grant tries to argue that you manipulated the estate division, we submit this envelope to a judge. It proves absolute premeditated prior knowledge. She willingly forfeited the asset to avoid the risk. She completely stripped herself of any moral or legal standing to demand a single cent from your current valuation." Naomi immediately suggested filing a preemptive lawsuit against my sister for estate manipulation, but I looked at the chaotic pile of papers on the attic floor and shook my head. A lawsuit was loud, incredibly expensive, and would drag on for years in the Connecticut courts. It would tie up my capital and make me look like a bitter, vindictive sibling fighting over a family will. I did not want to fight Avery in a courtroom over the past. I wanted to completely annihilate Grant's massive commercial project in the present, right at the exact moment he believed he had won. Instead of filing a lawsuit, I instructed Naomi to execute a silent, razor-sharp offensive strategy. First, I reached out to the executive director of a highly respected, heavily funded coastal conservation trust operating out of Portland. I invited their board of directors to the Lantern House for a private, highly catered weekend. I presented them with my own vision for the coastline. Within 3 days, we quietly executed a binding memorandum of understanding. The trust agreed to formally partner with my estate to expand our operations into a protected sustainable marine cultural center. This legally anchored my property to a massive environmental nonprofit, meaning Grant could never attempt to use municipal eminent domain to seize my land without triggering a catastrophic statewide environmental and public relations war. Simultaneously, I executed the final fatal trap. I had been closely monitoring the county tax delinquency notices for months. There was a tiny, seemingly useless quarter-acre lot located directly adjacent to the old abandoned municipal parking area at the base of the cliff. It was nothing but a patch of rocky weeds and broken asphalt. But if you looked at the logistical blueprints of Grant's proposed marina, that specific quarter-acre was the exact turning radius required for any heavy commercial construction vehicle to access the shoreline. The lot went up for public county auction on a rainy Thursday morning. I attended in person, sitting quietly in the back row of the municipal gymnasium. I paid exactly $14,000 in a cashier's check. I walked out of the building holding the absolute, uncontested deed to the only logistical entry point of Grant's dream. I now controlled the path down the cliff, and I controlled the landing pad at the bottom. The steel trap was completely armed, and the jaws were locked open, waiting. 2 weeks later, the Blackthorn Cove town clerk posted the official public notice on the municipal bulletin board and in the local newspaper. The final open session town council hearing to review and vote on the Holloway Meridian Development zoning application was officially scheduled. I stood on the sidewalk outside the town hall, reading the bold black ink of the printed notice. I checked the calendar date printed at the top of the page. I could not help the slow, sharp smile that spread across my face. The hearing was scheduled for the second Tuesday of November. It was exactly 5 years down to the very day since I had driven into this frozen, hostile town with nothing but a rotting deed and a broken heart. The universe had provided the absolute perfect stage, and I was fully prepared to burn my sister's house down to the ground. The air inside the Blackthorn Cove Municipal Gymnasium was thick with tension and the smell of damp wool coats. Every folding chair was occupied by local business owners, fishermen, and curious residents. Exactly at 7:00 in the evening, the town council called the open hearing to order. Avery and Grant walked down the center aisle looking like they owned the building. Avery wore a tailored charcoal blazer, projecting an aura of effortless wealth, while Grant carried a thick leather portfolio. They took their seats in the front row, flanked by 3 serious-looking corporate attorneys and 2 silent men who clearly represented their private equity investors. When Grant caught my eye across the aisle, he offered a tight, patronizing smile. He honestly believed I was going to crack under the pressure of a public forum. Grant took the podium first. He delivered a masterful, highly polished presentation. For 45 minutes, he painted a golden vision of Blackthorn Cove's future. He displayed massive digital renderings of the proposed luxury marina, throwing around staggering figures. He promised 300 new jobs, millions in annual tax revenue, and a revitalized commercial pier. Then, right on cue, he pivoted his narrative toward me. Using a perfectly crafted tone of regret, Grant explained to the town council that this entire economic miracle was being stonewalled by a single stubborn landowner clinging to an abandoned, useless dirt path. He framed my refusal to sign away the easement not as a defense of my property rights, but as a selfish, arrogant blockade against the prosperity of the entire working-class town. When he finished, a low murmur of agreement rippled through the back rows of the gymnasium. Grant sat down, looking immensely satisfied. He had successfully painted a massive target on my back. The council chairman adjusted his microphone and called my name. I stood up, but I did not walk to the podium alone. Naomi Mercer walked right beside me, carrying a banker's box filled with hard, indisputable legal facts. I did not offer a passionate weeping defense. I did not try to win the crowd with emotion. I simply let Naomi unpack the armory. Naomi took the microphone and systematically dismantled Grant's entire 45-minute presentation in less than 10 minutes. She did not argue about the economic value of a marina. Instead, she presented the town council with certified notarized copies of the heavy legal folder, proving continuous unbroken use of the deep water easement. Then, she pulled out the freshly stamped deed from the county tax auction. "My client does not just hold the right of way," Naomi stated, her voice ringing clearly through the silent gymnasium. 2 weeks ago, Lantern House Holdings legally acquired the quarter-acre transit lot at the base of the bluff. Mr. Holloway's proposed commercial development is now entirely landlocked. He literally cannot move a single piece of construction equipment onto that beach without trespassing on my client's private property. I watched the two private equity investors sitting behind Grant immediately sit up straight. Their bored expressions vanished, replaced by cold, calculating alarm. But Naomi was not finished. She pulled out the freshly signed memorandum of understanding. Furthermore, Naomi continued, handing copies to the council members. The Lanton House has officially entered into a binding long-term conservation and cultural partnership with the Portland Coastal Trust. The exact perimeter Mr. Holloway wishes to excavate is now federally recognized as a protected environmental buffer zone to support sustainable marine tourism. Tearing up the shoreline is no longer just a local zoning issue. It is a state-level environmental violation. The entire room erupted into shocked whispers. Grant's face lost all its color. He frantically leaned over, whispering furiously to his lead attorney, but the lawyer simply shook his head, looking completely defeated. The project was entirely dead in the water. Then came the final fatal blow. Naomi pulled the heavy manila envelope from her briefcase. She held it up so the entire room could see the faded Boston postmark. She explained exactly what the preliminary appraisal contained, highlighting the explicit valuation of the water access. We submit this document to the public record to clarify the intent behind the recent harassment my client has faced regarding this property, Naomi said smoothly. Mr. Holloway and his fiancée have repeatedly claimed they were offering a generous family buyout for a useless piece of land. However, this envelope proves they possessed full documented knowledge of the easement's massive commercial value 7 years ago. They are not trying to help the town. They are attempting to aggressively defraud my client out of an asset they previously abandoned because they refused to pay for the required structural repairs. I stepped up to the microphone, looking directly down at the front row. Avery was staring at the manila envelope in Naomi's hand, her mouth slightly open in absolute horror. The elegant, sophisticated mask she had worn her entire life completely shattered. I looked my sister dead in the eyes, my voice echoing loudly through the gymnasium speakers. You told me to take the Shabby house. I did, and I kept everything that came with it. The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. The investors sitting behind Grant stood up in unison. They did not say a single word. They simply picked up their briefcases, turned their backs on Grant, and walked straight out the double doors of the gymnasium. They knew a legally paralyzed, fundamentally deceptive project when they saw one. The project's financial lifeline was cut in an instant. That was the exact moment Avery completely lost her mind. The realization that she had just lost millions of dollars, lost her leverage, and lost her pristine reputation in front of an entire town broke her completely. She shot up from her folding chair, her face flushed with ugly, raw fury. She pointed a trembling finger at me, screaming at the top of her lungs. She demanded her rightful half of the estate. She shrieked that our parents would have never wanted me to hoard the family wealth, completely forgetting that she had taken every single liquid asset they owned 5 years prior. She threw a massive unhinged tantrum right in front of the town council, stripping away every last ounce of her manufactured grace and revealing the selfish, terrifyingly greedy person she truly was. The council chairman struck his gavel violently against his desk, demanding order. He immediately ordered the local police chief to escort Avery and Grant out of the building. The town watched in stunned, humiliating silence as my sister was marched out the side door, still screaming about her money while Grant followed closely behind her, his career effectively ruined. The council voted right then and there. They indefinitely tabled Grant's commercial zoning application. Following the vote, the representative from the Coastal Trust stood up and officially announced our joint expansion plan, guaranteeing that the Lanton House would continue to bring high-end sustainable tourism and well-paying local jobs to Blackfern Cove without destroying a single inch of the natural shoreline. The gymnasium erupted into genuine applause. 6 months later, the business news confirmed what I already knew. Holloway Meridian Developments officially filed for bankruptcy after their primary investors pulled out of 3 consecutive projects. Avery and Grant called off their engagement shortly after the financial collapse. I never heard from her again. On a warm, breezy evening in early May, I stood alone on the expansive wraparound porch of Hawthorne House. I leaned against the sturdy mahogany railing, holding a glass of iced tea, looking out at the sprawling property. A long, elegant string of warm yellow lights stretched across the manicured lawn, illuminating the path down toward the dark, crashing ocean. The sounds of laughter and quiet music drifted from the Carriage House studios. I took a deep breath of the salt air. I realized then that my greatest victory was not publicly humiliating my sister in a crowded gymnasium. It was not the money, and it was not the revenge. My greatest victory was standing exactly where I was. I took the rotting, discarded fragments of a broken family and painstakingly built a fortress of absolute peace. I transformed a curse into a sanctuary, forging a life so incredibly solid, so fiercely my own, that absolutely no one would ever be able to take it away from me. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from. So, please drop a comment below sharing your city or country so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Do not forget to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by as many people as possible. Thanks to all.